Imagine a global superpower, right? Like the absolute wealthiest, most militarily advanced empire on Earth.
Yeah.
They are brought to their knees not by an invading army, not by an economic collapse, but by frogs.
Right. It sounds almost like a joke when you put it like that.
It really does.
Yeah.
Because when we casually think about ancient texts or, biblical narratives like the famous 10 plagues of Egypt, there's this ingrained expectation of just, I don't know, random chaotic magic.
Yeah, like a divine magician just pulling destructive tricks out of a hat.
Exactly. Just to scare an ancient king into submission, like water turning to blood, bugs everywhere. It's usually painted in Sunday school as this unpredictable, slightly bizarre display of raw power.
It does feel like a scattershot approach
Sure.
when you only look at the surface, just throw every possible natural disaster at the wall, escalate the severity, and just see what finally breaks Pharaoh's resolve.
Yeah, but today we are going to look closer. Because when you actually dig into the historical and cultural context of ancient Egypt, that random magic show completely disappears. We're looking at a sequence of events that is, and I really don't use this term lightly, surgically precise.
Oh, absolutely. It is the absolute definition of a calculated systemic takedown. Like
Yeah.
every single event was designed to dismantle a very specific pillar of their reality.
And that is exactly why we are here. So welcome to today's deep dive. We're incredibly excited to have you joining us because we've curated a really fascinating stack of sources for you today.
We really have.
Yeah, we're looking at a diverse collection. We've got several in-depth theological commentaries, a deeply analytical sermon transcript, and some historical essays that all focus on the biblical book of Exodus.
And our mission for you today is to look way past the, flannel graph sanitized versions of this story.
Right, the kids' versions.
Exactly. We want to discover how this ancient text actually operates as a masterclass in psychological profiling, political maneuvering, and quite frankly, spiritual warfare.
Because to truly understand this narrative and why it's resonated for thousands of years, we really have to understand the mind of Pharaoh.
Yes. We have to step into the worldview of ancient Egypt, which was a place where the spiritual and the political were completely inseparable.
They were basically the same thing.
Right. To an ancient Egyptian, politics was religion, and religion was the economy. You couldn't disrupt one without collapsing all the others.
Right, and that's the through line in all these sources we pulled. They reveal that these plagues weren't just random acts of divine magic. They were highly calculated precision strikes against the very fabric of Egyptian society.
Systemic strikes.
Yeah. When I was reading through the material, the analogy that kept coming to my mind was like a modern cyber attack.
Oh, that's a good way to put it.
Like imagine a rival corporation taking down a massive tech giant. They don't just drive a bulldozer into the physical headquarters.
Right.
Instead, they systematically hack in and shut down their specific servers one by one, methodically, just to prove total, undeniable dominance.
That is a perfect analogy, actually. The plagues were quite literally direct assaults on the quote-unquote servers of the Egyptian pantheon.
Which is wild to think about.
It is. The sources point out that every single plague targeted a specific Egyptian deity to prove their absolute powerlessness. And to fully grasp this, you, as the listener, have to realize that these gods weren't just abstract ideas to the Egyptians.
They weren't just statues.
No, they were the practical mechanisms that made daily life function. So let's take the first plague, for example, turning the Nile River to blood.
Which, I mean, sounds terrifying on its purely physical merits alone. But there's a highly specific target there, isn't there? It's not just about ruining their drinking water.
Not at all. So the Egyptians worshipped a god named Hapi.
Okay.
And he was the patron of the Nile, believed to control its annual flooding. But even deeper than that, their theology taught that the Nile was the literal bloodstream of Osiris.
The god of the underworld.
Right. The god of all life, fertility, and the afterlife.
Huh.
So by turning the water to actual putrid blood, the God of the Hebrews is shutting down their two most vital spiritual servers on day one.
It's a demonstration of total supremacy.
Yeah.
You're literally watching the god of life visibly bleed out in front of you.
Exactly. It completely halts the economy, the agriculture, the daily rhythm, while simultaneously inflicting profound spiritual terror.
Wow.
And it systematically continues from there. The sources mention the third plague, right? The gnats rising from the dust.
Oh, right. Yeah.
That was a direct strike on Geb, the god of the earth. The dust of the earth itself, which Geb was supposed to govern, turns into an uncontrollable irritant.
And then there's the fourth plague. the swarms of insects.
Mm.
The commentaries in our sources note that these weren't just random flies, they were likely scarab beetles, which is a direct hit on Khepri.
Yeah, Khepri's a fascinating figure in their pantheon. He was a sun god, often depicted with the head of a scarab beetle.
A dung beetle.
Right, a dung beetle. The ancient Egyptians observed dung beetles rolling balls of dirt and emerging from the ground, and they connected that imagery to Khepri rolling the sun across the sky, self-creating every single morning.
Okay, that's actually really profound.
It was a beautiful, sacred symbol of life and cosmic order to them.
But then, God takes this deeply sacred symbol of the sun in creation and turns it into a suffocating swarm. I want you, listening to this right now, to just imagine this for a second.
It's a lot.
It really is. Imagine trying to conduct commerce or feed your family or go to the temple to pray when the literal creeping symbol of your sun god is crawling up your legs and filling your houses.
Yeah.
Imagine living in a society where your entire agricultural system, your economy, your daily schedule, and your deepest spiritual beliefs are intimately tied to these specific gods.
Yeah.
And you just have to stand there and watch them be systematically humiliated.
It is straight up psychological warfare. You are watching the invisible architecture of your reality be dismantled piece by piece.
So they've essentially shut down the water supply and the concept of life with the blood. But to truly break a society built on agriculture, you have to weaponize their fertility against them, which explains what is arguably the most bizarre of these systemic attacks.
The frogs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Let's look closely at the second plague, the frogs.
Yeah.
Out of everything in the animal kingdom, why frogs?
Well, to our modern sensibilities, an overabundance of frogs just sounds like a nuisance.
Right, just annoying.
Yeah, it's gross, it's loud, maybe it ruins a dinner party, but it doesn't scream, divine judgment. But in ancient Egypt, the frog was incredibly sacred. They worshipped the goddess Heket.
H-E-K-E-T.
Yes. She was depicted as a woman with the head of a frog, and she was the primary goddess of fertility and childbirth.
Which I guess makes logical sense when you think about the ecosystem of the Nile, right?
Precisely. After the annual flooding of the Nile, which was the absolute lifeblood of Egypt because it deposited all the rich silt that made farming possible, millions of frogs would appear in the mud.
Oh, so they were a sign of good things.
Yes. Their croaking was the literal sound of fertility, the sound of life returning to the land. And because of this deep association, intentionally killing a frog in ancient Egypt was strictly forbidden.
So couldn't kill them?
Nope. It was a serious religious offense.
Okay, so the Egyptians are suddenly buried in these creatures. They are in their beds, jumping into their kneading troughs, in their ovens, and they can't even kill them because doing so is a crime against their own religion.
It's a brilliant trap.
It's so brilliant. And here's where I want to push back a little, or at least explore a detail that genuinely confused me in the text. Exodus chapter 8 mentions a really bizarre caveat.
The magicians.
Yes, Pharaoh's magicians, using what the text calls their secret arts, actually step up and replicate the plague of frogs. Why would the God of the Exodus allow these opposing magicians to succeed at all?
It's a great question.
Because doesn't letting them do magic totally undermine the whole point of showing absolute supremacy?
It seems counterintuitive at first glance, for sure. But the commentaries in our stack address this directly. It's something literary scholars refer to as the exposure motif.
Exposure motif.
Yeah. The counterfeit power of the magicians is permitted, but only just enough to expose its absolute limits and its inherent absurdity.
Walk me through that.
Yeah.
How does making more frogs expose them?
Well, think about the practical reality of what the magicians actually accomplish here. Pharaoh's country is drowning in frogs. The noise is deafening, the smell is starting to turn. He needs them gone.
Right.
So he calls in his elite, highly paid spiritual advisors, and what do? They summon more frogs.
Oh.
They can replicate the problem to show off their parlor tricks, but they have absolutely zero power to reverse it.
Oh, wow. So the very people paid to fix the problem are actively participating in the destruction of the kingdom just to protect their own egos and reputations.
Exactly.
They literally just make the crisis worse for their own people.
They really do. It demonstrates the utter futility of human religion and counterfeit power to solve the systemic problems it aggravates. They are so desperate to prove they have power that they destroy their own country in the process.
That is such a bitter, bitter irony. And it reaches a breaking point very quickly. The sources note that by the very next plague, the magicians try to replicate it, they completely fail, and they finally just throw their hands up and admit to Pharaoh, this is the finger of God.
They tap out.
Yeah. They realize the game is over.
The counterfeit power burns out by round 3, But because the magicians couldn't remove the frogs, Pharaoh is forced into a humiliating corner. He has to actually go to Moses, the leader of his enslaved workforce, and ask for help.
Which must have killed him.
Oh, absolutely. And this introduces us to the incredibly complex, really fascinating psychology of Pharaoh's apologies.
Yes. The psychology here is wild and so deeply human. Moses says to Pharaoh, okay, you have the honor of telling me when you want these frogs gone. You name the exact time.
Right.
And Pharaoh, standing in a palace that is literally reeking of frogs, inexplicably says, tomorrow.
Yeah.
Why not today? Why not right this very second?
It is such a telling detail about human nature. Pharaoh is clinging to whatever tiny scrap of control he feels he has left. The commentary suggests he was likely hoping that if he waited just one more day, maybe the frogs would just die naturally on their own.
He's hoping for a coincidence.
Exactly.
Because if the frogs die naturally, Pharaoh gets to keep his worldview intact. He doesn't have to acknowledge that Moses' God is the one calling the shots. He's essentially bargaining with reality, choosing to live in delusion rather than admit defeat. It's the ultimate cognitive dissonance.
That's exactly it. If they die on their own, he doesn't have to yield his authority. But Moses prays the frogs die the very next day, exactly as promised, and they're piled up in rotting heaps. The source text literally says the land stank.
Gross.
But the moment Pharaoh sees that the immediate crisis is over, he immediately hardens his heart again.
It's like a child who only apologizes because they are terrified.
Yeah.
They're about to be grounded.
Yes.
Not because they actually feel remorse for what they did, but just because they want to escape the punishment. They cry, I'm sorry, I won't do it again. And the very second the parent says, okay, I won't ground you, the kid turns around and goes right back to the bad behavior.
That is exactly the dynamic at play. And the sermon transcript we reviewed really breaks down this psychological pattern beautifully. The pastor points out that Pharaoh actually says the words, I have sinned.
Right.
It sounds, on the surface, like true repentance. But he constantly minimizes it. He adds these little qualifiers like, I have sinned this time. Or he begs Moses for forgiveness just this once.
Just this once. The ultimate red flag of a fake apology. It's the language of a hostage negotiator, not someone who has actually changed their mind.
Right. And the sermon notes that Pharaoh changes his mind 11 times throughout this narrative.
11 times.
11 times. He doesn't actually have a reverence for truth. He just wants the painful consequences to stop. The moment the relief comes, the repentance vanishes into thin air.
And what's fascinating is how these ancient psychological and spiritual battles don't just stay neatly in the past. The sources we're looking at demonstrate how deeply these ancient texts are mapped onto highly charged modern political realities today.
They really are.
The ancient text is still actively being used as a lens to interpret our current cultural moments.
That's a vital point. The themes of power, hypocrisy, and systemic injustice are timeless, so commentators naturally bridge them to the present day.
Yeah, for instance, one of the essays in our sources contrasts the ancient Egyptians' deep cultural reverence for children, symbolized by that frog goddess of childbirth, Hecate, with Pharaoh's incredibly cruel decree from earlier in the Exodus story, where he systematically ordered the drowning of Hebrew baby boys in the Nile. And the source author explicitly connects this ancient state-sponsored infanticide to the modern political debate surrounding abortion in America, citing that over 60 million pregnancies have been aborted. Now, just to be very clear with you listening, our goal today isn't to take a stance on modern political debates, but rather to show you how these sources are applying ancient texts to modern issues. We are strictly impartial here.
Completely impartial. We're just looking at the commentary.
Right. The source author is making a direct link here, arguing that Pharaoh serves as this archetype for how a society can simultaneously claim to revere life while destroying it.
It's a profound observation about systemic hypocrisy. Whether someone agrees with that author's specific modern application or not, it highlights the enduring, almost haunting weight of the text.
Yeah.
Pharaoh represents a system that builds monuments to fertility and life, literally worshiping a goddess of childbirth, while simultaneously using the machinery of the state to eliminate a vulnerable population when it becomes economically or politically inconvenient.
The ultimate hypocrisy of the system, worshiping fertility while drowning babies. It's a devastating contradiction.
Yes, and that contradiction, that hypocrisy, doesn't just happen in a vacuum. It is rooted deeply in Pharaoh's internal state, which
Yeah.
forces us to look beyond his outward actions, the fake apologies, the political maneuvering, and examine what the biblical text calls his hardened heart.
Right, and this brings us to one of the most famous and honestly most philosophically difficult phrases in the entire narrative, the idea that God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Yeah, that's a tough one.
Let me just raise the ultimate philosophical pushback here, because I know you, listening, are probably thinking the exact same thing. If God is the one actively hardening Pharaoh's heart, preventing him from doing the right thing, how is it remotely fair to punish him for it?
Right.
What does this all mean for human free will? Are we just puppets?
It's the classic conundrum of determinism versus free will. The Apostle Paul even wrestles with this exact question thousands of years later in Romans chapter 9. But if we look closely at the actual mathematical breakdown in the Hebrew text, as highlighted in our sermon source, a very different, much more nuanced picture emerges.
Okay, lay it on me.
So the phrase about Pharaoh's heart being hardened is mentioned 14 times in the book of Exodus.
14 times. Okay, let's look at the data.
For the first 6 times it happens, the text explicitly says that Pharaoh hardened his own heart. It was his deliberate, calculated choice. Then there's a messy middle period where the phrasing goes back and forth. It is only in the final 5 instances, after the country has been utterly devastated and the point of no return has been crossed, that the text shifts and says, God hardened Pharaoh's heart.
Oh, wow. So it's a distinct progression. It's not God swooping in on day one, hijacking his brain, and forcing a good, humble man to be evil.
Not at all. The sources connect the dots beautifully here. God is not overriding Pharaoh's moral agency. Pharaoh had already repeatedly, stubbornly, and violently chosen his path. He built a system of oppression and refused to dismantle it. By the end of the narrative, God is simply solidifying the trajectory that Pharaoh had already firmly committed to.
It's like gravity. At a certain point, you've leaned so far over the edge of the cliff that you're going to fall. You've made your choice, and the universe just stops holding you back. God is essentially giving Pharaoh exactly what he wants. You want to be stubborn and unyielding? Fine, I will make you immovable.
Exactly. It is the ultimate terrifying consequence, being completely handed over to your own destructive desires. But to truly understand the sheer weight of this concept of a hardened heart, and I mean weight quite literally, we have to look at what that exact phrase meant to an ancient Egyptian living in that specific culture.
We've been building to this. Here's where it gets really interesting to me.
It truly does. We turn to a massive historical reveal provided by the late Rabbi Jonathan Sacks in one of our commentary sources. He points out that the Hebrew text doesn't just use one generic word. It actually uses 3 different highly specific words to describe the hardening of Pharaoh's heart.
Okay.
And one of those words is KVD, or kavod, which translates literally to making heavy.
Making heavy, like adding a physical weight to it.
Precisely. And to an ancient Egyptian, especially a pharaoh, the concept of a heavy heart meant something very specific and utterly terrifying. It ties directly into their foundational cultural concept called Ma'at.
M-A-T.
Yes, Ma'at was the supreme cosmic order. It represented universal truth, balance, justice, and morality. The sun rising, the Nile flooding, society functioning fair, that was all Ma'at.
Okay.
And it was Pharaoh's literal job description, his divine mandate, to ensure Ma'at prevailed in the world.
So the entire functioning of the universe basically rests on his shoulders. How does the heavy heart fit into this concept of Ma?
Well, in the Egyptian religion, beautifully detailed in their ancient Book of the Dead, they believed that in the afterlife, every single soul faced a definitive trial. Your heart, which they believed housed the soul, the mind, and your moral ledger, was placed on a physical scale in the Hall of Judgment.
A literal scale.
Yeah. And on the other side of the scale was a single, pure ostrich feather, which represented the goddess Ma'at, or truth and justice.
A literal weighing of the heart against truth.
Yes. The stakes couldn't be higher. If your heart was as light as the feather, it meant you had lived a just life and you passed into eternal paradise. But if your heart was heavier than the feather, meaning it was weighed down by a lifetime of cruelty, oppression, or injustice, it was immediately devoured by a terrifying demon goddess named Ammit.
Ammit.
Yeah, she was a monstrous hybrid, part lion, part hippopotamus, and part crocodile. If she ate your heavy heart, your soul was condemned to cease existing entirely. Total annihilation.
Oh my goodness, the light bulb just went on. The absolute genius of this text. By the Hebrew author continually saying Pharaoh's heart was made heavy, using that specific word KVD, it is not just a poetic metaphor for being stubborn. It is a massive, incredibly calculated theological insult.
You nailed it.
It is explicitly telling the Egyptians that their own semi-divine leader, the very guy whose only job is to keep cosmic balance, is currently failing his own ultimate spiritual test in real time. God isn't just sending bugs. He's exposing Pharaoh as a cosmic failure on his own religion's terms.
It is an incredible subversion of their theology. Pharaoh was supposed to be the ultimate defender of Ma'at. But the sources give us this final, profound insight into his tragic flaw. Pharaoh was, ultimately, a prisoner of his own corrupt political system.
How so?
Think about it from a purely economic standpoint. He couldn't just let a massive population of enslaved Israelites walk out into the desert without risking his empire's entire economy, an economy built entirely on the foundation of free slave labor.
Oh, wow. So he's trapped by the monster he built. To let them go is to admit his empire is a fragile house of cards.
He is. In trying to preserve the order of his empire, he committed the ultimate offense against Ma'at. He brutally oppressed the powerless, and by desperately trying to hold on to that unjust order, by refusing to yield to reality, he ended up creating total, devastating chaos across his entire nation. The more he tried to defend an indefensible system, the heavier his heart grew, until it dragged his entire empire down with him.
Wow. That completely reshapes how I will ever read this story again. It's not just a chaotic sequence of bloody rivers and frogs. It's the systematic, surgical dismantling of a corrupt empire from the inside out, starting with the Pharaoh's own soul.
It really is a masterpiece of a narrative.
So as we wrap up today's deep dive, let's just recap the journey we've been on together. We started with what looked like a random magic show, only to uncover a precision cyber attack on the Egyptian gods. We looked at Hecate, the frog-headed goddess of fertility, and saw the bitter irony of how counterfeit power only makes our crises worse. We analyzed Pharaoh's fake apologies, his just this once bargaining, and how his cognitive dissonance mirrors the systemic hypocrisies of our own modern world. And finally, we ended up in the cosmic scales of the Egyptian afterlife, watching a heavy heart condemn an entire empire.
It's a heavy journey.
It is. But now, we want to turn this directly back to you listening right now. Because a story this powerful, with this much psychological depth, demands a bit of personal reflection. When you face the consequences of your own actions, are you truly changing your ways? Or are you, like Pharaoh, just trying to bargain with reality to get the frogs to go away for one more day?
That's a great question.
What is the unjust system, the stubborn refusal in your own life that might be making your own heart heavy?
Those are exactly the piercing questions this text has forced generations to ask themselves. And before we go, I want to leave you with one final, eerily fascinating detail from our sources to mull over on your own.
Please do.
We talked a lot about the frog plague today and its connection to counterfeit power. But the imagery of that specific plague doesn't actually end in the book of Exodus. Thousands of years later, the biblical book of Revelation, specifically chapter 16, verse 13, picks up this exact imagery again.
Really?
Yeah. It describes demonic spirits like frogs emerging from the mouths of a false trinity in the ultimate end times conflict. It is a chilling, profound reminder of how these ancient symbols of counterfeit power, deception, and rebellion ripple all the way to the very end of history.
A truly heavy thought to leave on for sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. The next time you hear about the plagues, remember it was never just a magic trick. It was a calculated, precise exposure of a heavy heart. Until next time, keep digging and keep questioning.